but she's supposed to be the most woke of all of them.
I knew you were going to say that. Don't fucking say that.
I had to.
Welcome to the Nerds You're Looking For podcast, a nerd culture podcast that discusses nerddom through various segments. You can find us at thenerdspodcast.com, facebook.com/thenerdspodcast. You can follow our Twitter and Instagrams at thenerdspodcast, and then you can email us at thenerdsyou'relooking4@gmail.com. We also have a YouTube page that is The Nerds You're Looking For, I believe. I don't really do it much, so I'm not quite sure what the web address is, but I thought that I would help pad out and plug that a little bit. But either way, like I was saying, I'm here with my co-host, as always, Mr. YouTube himself, Pat Attack. What's up, man?
I feel like I should just start my own YouTube account and then just call it Pat Attack.
Yeah, at this point, like I'm trying to make it a brand for you, so...
Yeah, for sure. So I'm good, man. I'm very well rested. I was telling you before we started recording, and I think I tweeted this out that so I didn't sleep very well the night before on Friday night because my asshole neighbors were shooting off fireworks. So I have to work Saturday morning, so I didn't get much sleep the night before. And so my wife and I had this whole date night planned when I got home from work, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to lay down. I'm real tired. I'm going to lay down. I'm going to get well rested, and then we're going to go out and we're going to have a nice date night. I was like, wake me up in like 30 minutes. And 6 hours went by. And I woke up at like 9 o'clock and I had to apologize to my wife. I was like, yeah, I'm sorry that happened. I guess we'll do something tomorrow night. So I just ended up like napping for like 6 hours and then watching Westworld the rest of the night.
I mean, I'll tell you what I tell my wife when she does that. At that point, it is not napping. It is just going to sleep.
Well, see, it was a nap because, yes, I did sleep for 6 hours, but then I stayed up for another like 3 or 4 hours, and then I just went to sleep. Like, I was honestly worried that I wasn't going to be able to go to sleep, that my wife was just going to wake up the next day, and I was going to still be awake from the night before because I slept for that long, because I'm a bit of an insomniac, so if I kind of break myself from the cycle that I have to be on, it's really hard for me to get back on there. But apparently I was really fucking tired because like 3 or 4 hours later I ended up falling back asleep. So, but I think that also had a little bit to do with the episode of Westworld that I was watching that we'll get into here. We're going to be reviewing the second season of Westworld here for our main topic. So we'll get into that here in a little bit. So I think that helped a little bit, that the episode I was watching was pretty dry.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. We will definitely get into that. But I do have a question. Why didn't Chrissy wake you up?
Apparently she tried to. And I just like, and then I just ignored her. Apparently, according to her, she tried to wake me up several times.
Wow. So that makes it even a little bit more depressing, as she was like trying to wake you up to go do this date night and you just shrugged it off. Yeah,
pretty much. I don't remember that, and if you know my wife, you know that she's a bold-faced liar, so I don't believe that she ever tried to wake me up.
Oh, man. She's probably like the purest person on the planet.
She's like the nicest person ever. That's what makes that a joke.
Well, our listeners don't know your wife, so I felt like I had to say that.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm pretty confident that most people know like opposites attract, and I'm a terrible person. I mean, it's pretty well established on this podcast that I'm a pretty bad person, so I feel like that definitely applies with us.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. 100%.
All right. So if this is your first episode, we kind of just start off each episode by kind of just checking in with each other. We call it What We're Into. It's the first segment of each episode of the podcast. So Tyler, what are you into this week?
I'm going to talk about Tag, the recent film that came out. I think it came out like 2 weeks ago. This is not necessarily what I wanted to talk about this week, but I literally did nothing this week except for go to Cincinnati for work and then watch Westworld. So, that being the case, I kind of had to reach back a little bit, to find something for this segment. But my wife and I saw this movie last weekend, I think last Saturday. So, I was actually really into the concept of this movie. Like when I saw the trailers, I think a lot of people kind of shrugged it off as being a dumb concept, but I thought that it was kind of interesting because not only do I think that the true story that this is based on carries interest, but as I get older now and more sentimental in my old age, I like the idea of friends trying to stay connected, and that really pulls on my heartstrings a little bit. And I've said before that movies that elicit an emotional response from me typically land amongst my favorites because for me, that's the most invested you could be in a story, is if it gets an emotional reaction out of you. The problem with this movie is that it never really got to that point for me. It has some pacing issues and some weird story quirks that kind of took me out of it. So, I mean, if I'm going to break this down kind of like how we break down our reviews, like from a story standpoint, I think that there's just way too much time spent on this group of friends planning on how they're going to tag their friend Jerry instead of focusing on the ins and outs of their friendship. There are some fun flashbacks and, some context given to certain things, but then there are these elaborate set pieces where Jerry just outwits the group of friends that are not realistic at all. So the problem here is that the true story that this is based off of is already goofy enough as it is. Like, this group of grown men that are playing a game of tag that they've played their whole lives. Like, that's already a pretty out there concept. So, they kind of take the audience out of it by turning it up to 11. There's like one set piece where Jerry, the character played by Jeremy Renner, sets up a bunch of elaborate traps in the forest for his friends as they're trying to tag him. And then there's another place, in the movie where he somersaults out of a window to avoid being tagged. And just those weird things like that really, really took me out of it and was really disappointing. There are also other weird story quirks that don't make sense if all of these guys are best friends. An example is the character of Jerry is getting married in this movie, and he didn't invite his friends to the wedding because he knew they'd show up anyways. So the whole thing is they play this game of tag every May, and he's getting married on May 31st. So he knew that since it was during the game of tag, they'd all show up anyways, which doesn't make much sense. It doesn't make much sense with me telling this to you, and then it doesn't make much sense when you watch the movie either. It's just a little disappointing. So obviously some very weird plot choices and twists throughout this movie, especially in the third act. I won't spoil what happens in the third act, but there was one plot choice that felt very weird, and then there was another that was more of a twist that did not land like they expected it to because I wasn't bought into it in the first place. And I know I'm being very vague, but if you see the movie, you will 100% as soon as it happens know exactly what I'm talking about. So from a performance standpoint within this movie, no one really delivers a bad performance per se. I mean, if you look at the cast, they definitely compiled a great group of actors here. You have John Hamm, Jeremy Renner, Ed Helms, Hannibal Buress, oh my gosh, Jake Johnson, Isla Fisher. So, definitely a great group of actors, a lot of them comedic. The problem is I never really bought into them as being lifelong friends, and I don't know if that's more of a performance problem or a story problem, but it's still an issue. And then, lastly, from a comedy standpoint, I will say that there were some pretty funny moments throughout the movie. I laughed quite a few times, so that was a plus. But the problem at the end of the day is I wanted this to be more than what it was. I wanted it to be more than just a few laugh R-rated movie. So I came away pretty disappointed.
Yeah, that's disappointing because I was interested in this movie for a lot of reasons that you talked about, like wanting to see the movie because of this or that. And for two big reasons for me is one, it reminded me of something that me and my buddies used to do from high school. We had a thing. I mean, it's not our thing. We took it from Seinfeld, but we used to celebrate Festivus, but we didn't celebrate it around Christmas. We celebrated it around October 1st, and I don't really remember the story of why October 1st was picked, but it was always something that we did, even when we went away to college for, I think, pretty much the entire time I was in college. We would go back to my buddy Mike's house and actually get together and do this. And I remember one year, one of our buddy's girlfriends came and even said that. She's like, it's really cool that you guys do this every year. Like, most people just forget about their friends after they graduate high school, but you guys make an effort every year to kind of come together and do something cool, even though it's, you say everything that you hate about each other and wrestle eventually. So, but it was just kind of a reason for all of us to get back together. And so that kind of this movie to kind of remind me of that. We don't do it anymore. We'll send each other like Facebook messages or whatever on October 1st and just kind of try to keep the tradition alive, but we've all kind of grown up and gotten too busy to do it. But this movie definitely reminded me of that. And a second reason I kind of wanted to see this movie is it reminded me of the movie that I think you might have brought up earlier this year, Game Night, which is a comedy with Jason Bateman, and I actually ended up watching it not too long ago. I think it was maybe it was even a month ago. It doesn't matter. And I remember you liking it. Definitely, it sounded like you liked it a little bit more, if I'm remembering correctly, a little bit more than you liked Tag. I fucking loved Game Night. I absolutely, I don't want to say blown away. I don't want to be too strong about it, but it's definitely currently on my top 10 of 2018 right now.
Wow.
I really enjoyed it. I mean, we've talked about this before. You're a big board game guy, probably a little bit bigger than me, but that was something that we did when you lived in Evansville, is every once in a while we would get together and have a game night. And so obviously I had attachment to game night because of that. And it's just a really funny movie. It's definitely crazy. I mean, it definitely goes off the rails at times, but it always kind of brings you back with some of the more emotional stuff, and they really make it more of a character-driven movie. So I really enjoyed it. It doesn't help, or it doesn't hurt, that it's really funny. I thought it was really, really funny. So, especially the Denzel Washington stuff, I thought that really hit really, really hard in that movie. I thought that was fucking genius. It was really, really funny. So, yeah, this movie, Tag, reminded me of Game Night. And so, I was looking forward to it. Not enough, obviously, to see it right off the bat, but, it's a little disappointing that it didn't, end up being that for you, at least.
Yeah, I definitely would say I liked Game Night more than this movie. And I would watch this movie again. Like, whenever it hits Netflix or something, I'll probably watch it again because there were enjoyable moments. I think that it's a situation where I built it up as being one thing, and I don't think that the trailers help with that. I think the trailers made it seem like it was one thing and it ended up not being that thing. So that's what I was most disappointed with, was the friendship aspect of it kind of fell flat to me. So anyways, what are you into?
So I am into something that, if you watch our YouTube channel, you know I streamed this, I think last Sunday, Limbo, which is a game that originally came out on Xbox 360, but eventually was ported over to the Xbox One. It is made by Play Dead, which is one of my favorite indie developers of all time. Like, they're just amazing. It's a platformer game, which I'm like obsessed with those games. Like, I really enjoy puzzle platformer games. And when I first started, we did the YouTube channel like years ago, but we didn't really know what to do with it until I really started get back into gaming. And I was like, well, I kind of want this to be a gaming channel. And so I did a walkthrough, and this is like pre-face cam and everything. I did a walkthrough of a game called Inside, and that's a Play Dead game as well. And it's kind of like the spiritual sequel to Limbo. Like, Limbo came out, I want to say, I don't even remember. I want to say it's 2012, something like that. Like, it's been out for a really long time. And, everybody talked about it like it was like, it's going to change the genre. And then when Inside came out, that's the only reason I even knew anything about Inside, was because everybody was going crazy. Like, we're finally getting like a spiritual sequel to this game that everybody loved. And I played Inside, and it's fucking amazing. Like, it's everything that everybody said Limbo was. And I really wanted to play Limbo, and I just never got around to it. Especially the early days of the YouTube channel, it was hard for me to play anything other than what I was playing on the YouTube channel. And so finally, a couple of weeks ago, I decided, I was like, just kind of sitting around, and I wanted something to play that I didn't really need to like get really, really invested into, and just kind of play casually. And so I was like, you know what? I've had Limbo sitting on my hard drive forever, and I really need to play it. And I knew that it would only take a few hours. So I was like, I can bust this out in one night. Well, I forget that as much as I like these games, I'm not very good at them. So I die a lot in this game, especially in this kind of like trial and death type of game. And so it took me a little bit longer than a night. I ended up playing it throughout the week, and like a few hours here and there throughout the week. And it's just a fantastic game. The puzzles change throughout the game, so you never really feel like it's being repetitive. It's very dark. Like, if you like very morbid games, it's definitely, like I said, it's trial and death. Like, you're this little kid, and you get dropped in this world, and you have to figure out these puzzles. And if you don't figure them out, you die. And like, a lot of times it's very gruesome deaths. Like, there's moments where there's like these buzz saws that you have to like jump over and figure out how to get over them. And if you don't, they chop you up, and there's blood, and they're like, your pieces go flying everywhere. And I read an article somewhere, because somebody, I think, asked one of the developers why they made it a little boy and why they made some of the deaths so gruesome. And they're like, because we want you to care about this character, and we want you to succeed, not just because you want to beat the game, but you also don't want to see this little kid get chopped into bits. So I think that was kind of cool reasoning why they did it. But yeah, the puzzles are really great. And I really enjoy platforming games like this. And I like the fact that in Insides like this too, where they don't really explain anything. Like, they don't take the time to write a story and do all of these things. And I'm sure they have some like outline of the game, like some kind of like backstory to some of this stuff, but they don't explain any of that to you. Like, it's left up to your imagination. And if you go up on the internet and look up theories about Limbo and even Inside, there's a shit ton of people that have a lot of crazy theories about what this game's about, because they don't tell you anything. They just literally drop you in to this game, and you just start, and you just have to get through all these crazy puzzles, especially Limbo, because I won't spoil anything, even though the game's been out for a while now. But there is kind of a twist towards the end, which I appreciated, and it really kind of feeds into all the theories. Like, most of the theories about this game have a lot to do with how the game ends. So if you're good at these games, this game is a pretty short one. I think it only should take you about 3 hours the first time you play it. Technically, I've seen people do speed runs of this game in like 40 minutes, which I can only imagine, like, you would have to not die at all. And that's what I was trying to stream the other night. Not a speed run, because I'm not into that, but there's a achievement that I've yet to get. I'm 12 out of 13 achievements on this game, and the last one I have to get is you have to beat the game in one sitting with only dying 5 or less times. And of course, I haven't been able to do that yet. So I'm definitely still going to try and 100% it before I write my video game journal entry for this game, because I definitely want to 100% it, because it's just fantastic.
So I heard you say it, but I don't know that I fully got it. So so if you don't die, you could complete this game in 40 minutes, but like, what kind of gameplay are we talking about here? Like, how many hours would you say it is?
Well, technically, not doing the speed run or anything like that, because there's a lot of little like tricks that I've seen people do that can speed up the game a little bit. But I've tried to do the achievement dying 5 or less times, and I didn't quite get there. I think I think the best I've ever done is died like 7 or 8 times. Usually I just start over at the 5th death, because I know I'm not going to make it the rest of the game without dying. But honestly, I think it might take you maybe an hour and 20 but the first time you play it is probably going to take you at least 3 because you're not going to obviously know how to do a lot of these puzzles.
Gotcha. And what's the price tag?
Well, I think I bought it when it was on sale for like $5 or something like that. I think you can get, if I remember correctly, they have like a package with Limbo and Inside for like $20, which for those 2 games for $20, like that's a steal right now. I paid, I think 20 just for Inside when it first came out, and I still think that was worth it. But neither one of these games are super long, and I know we had that conversation maybe, I don't remember, it was a couple episodes ago, it might have actually been last episode, where it's like, at what point do you justify a price tag as far as how many hours you put into this game? But I've put in probably at least 10 hours, but most of that has been trying to get the achievement of only dying 5 or less times.
Yeah, so, I mean, this sounds kind of right up my alley as somebody who has struggled to find a lot of time throughout the week to devote to gaming. This sounds like something I'd be really interested in because it's something that, you know, you can bust out in a few hours, isn't crazy expensive, but is still a really awesome game. So my interest is definitely peaked here.
So my wife doesn't particularly like video games that much. I mean, she'll play Zelda and stuff like that, and we'll play Super Smash Brothers and like Mario Kart and stuff like that. So, I mean, she's not necessarily not a gamer, but she doesn't really play them that often. But like, I would sit down, like as she was making dinner or whatever, I'd sit down and start playing this game, and I would pause it when we'd eat dinner together, and then I'd come back in the living room, and she would sometimes sit there and watch me play this game. Like, that's how interesting this game is and how cool the puzzles and stuff are. So yeah, I think that it is definitely worthwhile to check out. She's also some of the games that she likes are these puzzle types of platformer games. So that also helped. Occasionally I'd be like, what do you think? Like, I would just look over and be like, you need to help me with this because I'm not getting something about this game because I'm just struggling with this puzzle. And then, of course, just having that other set of eyes on the puzzle really helped at times.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's cool too. My wife typically likes those types of games as well. So it might be something that she could get into as well.
For sure. So our next segment is just plainly called Comics. We read a ton of comics each week, and we like to spotlight 1 or 2 an episode. So what'd you read this week?
I read Multiple Man #1.
Oh, I almost read this. I almost did.
I thought that you were, which is why I texted you yesterday night to see, because there were 2 new #1s from Marvel this week. There was Multiple Man #1 and there was Sentry #1, and I figured you would read one of those. So that's why I texted you, so I didn't.
When you texted me that, I kind of chuckled to myself because I was like, there's no fucking way that we're going to read the same book this week.
Yeah. Well, I figured that if it was Multiple Man or something that I would maybe have interest in, you would have proactively let me know, but I wanted to be sure so we didn't like sit down to record and have the same book that we read. So, yeah, that being said, obviously you read something else and I'm excited to hear about what you read, but I do want to dive into Multiple Man, written by Matt Rosenberg, drawn by Andy McDonald. This, of course, focuses on the character Jamie Madrox, who is also known as you can guess, probably the Multiple Man. This is a mini-series, actually. It's the first of either 5 or 6 issues. I can't remember, but mini-series like this are typically 6 issues, so that's what I'm going to go with. The review here that I'm going to give this comic is almost a tale of 2 halves. The book starts out really strong. We follow the group of New Mutants, who find Jamie Madrox in an underground bunker, even though he was thought to be dead from the Terrigen Mist a few years ago. But like I said, the New Mutants find him. They take him back to Hank McCoy, who we all know as Beast, and he reveals that this Jamie is a duplicate of Jamie Prime and that he's dying very quickly. So, I don't know all of the rules about Multiple Man. Like, it's not a character that I'm extremely familiar with, but from what I understand, with his powers, if Jamie Prime dies, all of his duplicates die as well. So then, for me, that layered in another aspect as to how this version is still alive. And we don't get the answer to that question just yet, but he is dying very rapidly because the host, Jamie, I guess you could say, is no longer around. So the first portion of this book with them finding him and taking him to Beast is really good. There's some really snappy dialogue and there's some fun with the characters that I really enjoyed. And I think that the character of Jamie Madrox is an interesting one because he's an X-Man, but he's written off as a really self-centered and annoying character. So I think that that's kind of interesting. With that being said, we then get into the second half of the book, which is not great. So Jamie, knowing that he's dying and that Beast may not be able to find a solution in time, takes matters into his own hands. And while I won't spoil it, time travel is involved here. So the second half of the book feels completely unlike the first half, which is where this identity crisis kind of comes in. There's that aspect of it. And then there's the fact that this book reminds me of Westworld in a bit, in that Jamie never really feels like a real person because he's just a duplicate of Jamie Prime. And of course, we'll talk about that a little bit in our Westworld review, but that's kind of the feeling I got by reading his story. The question I kept asking myself was, do I honestly care about his survival? I think that if they had explored that idea a little bit more, it could have been an interesting miniseries. Like if, this duplicate of Multiple Man was kind of having an identity crisis and, was questioning his existence. Like I think that would have been interesting, but, that topic never ends up being broached, and it was kind of the elephant in the room for me. I feel like anytime I talk about a comic, I want to make sure I touch on the art, and I will say that the art in this book is pretty good. But there wasn't enough here to keep me interested in this miniseries, which is disappointing because I genuinely do like the character. It's just, there's the plot points in the second half of the book that I left out for spoilers reasons that are really fucking weird that turned me off. So I will not recommend Multiple Men.
So like I said, considered reading this book, but then ultimately decided against it just because I was like, you know what? I'm not really all that into the character, and I would just be reading it because it's a Marvel #1 and I love Marvel so much. And I want to ask you a question real quick. Do you think this book would even exist if it wasn't for the James Franco movie potential?
That was the first thing I thought whenever I saw this book was coming out, was I don't know that there's any interest for a Multiple Man series. It has to be just to kind of, test the waters if they're really considering to make this movie with James Franco. So that's 100% what I thought. I'll be interested to see if that's the case.
Yeah, I'm definitely intrigued to see if it even happens. If I had to put money on it, I would say that movie's never going to happen just because he's not that interesting. At least for me, he's not that interesting of a character, and there's so many X-Men that you could do a movie for. I just don't understand why they would want to do that particular character. And now the whole Fox and Disney thing, I doubt that a lot of these movies that were rumored are actually going to happen.
Yeah, you would imagine at this point that they are not going to be interested in continuing any of the X-Men movies that Fox made, and they're going to want to kind of rebrand it as part of the MCU once the deal goes through. So I would imagine that movie will not be made.
I thought it was unlikely to begin with just because I just didn't think that character necessarily deserved to have its own movie. I still obviously don't think that it deserves to have its own movie. So I'd be really, really shocked if it got its own movie. But I mean, James Franco does have the star power. If he really wanted to get it made, I'm sure that he could probably make it happen. But with this whole deal, I think that it's even more unlikely that it gets made.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, the allegations that came out with him around Oscar season.
Sure.
I mean, that probably made them take a step back as well too. So
for sure.
Yeah. All that being said, what'd you read?
So I read a book that I honestly didn't even know had come out or was in plans to come out or anything like that. And I'm really shocked because we're both big horror fans and we're both big John Carpenter fans. So apparently he has his own like comic anthology series that he does. He doesn't write them, but he's kind of almost like TV has their showrunners that just kind of oversee everything. And that's kind of what he does with this particular series. And it's called John Carpenter's Tales of Science Fiction. And the one that I'm reading, the one that just started this past week, is the Standoff #1. And I guess this is the second of these anthology series. I didn't read the first one. I'm not quite sure. I don't remember what the first one was called, but I had heard good things about it. But yeah, I hadn't read it yet. And I was definitely intrigued by the Standoff just because, I mean, right off the bat, you have John Carpenter and then you have science fiction, which is pretty much my favorite genre. So I was sold no matter what. I was reading this book, and it was written by David J. Sco and then Andreas Esparza. No way. And it was published by Storm King Comics, which when we talk about reading a lot of different indie publishers and stuff, and so I've at least heard of some of these publishers. Maybe I've never read some of their work before, but I've at least heard of them. This is the first time I've ever heard of Storm King Comics. You would have thought that John Carpenter would have been able to publish it at a bigger publisher, but that's not the point. The point is the Standoff any good? And I really, really enjoyed it. You mentioned trying to point out the artwork when we talk about comics, and I really, really enjoyed the artwork. It reminded me, of course, and this is an easy comparison because it's a John Carpenter movie, but it reminded me, the plot plus the artwork reminded me a lot of The Thing. Just the way that there's going to be a lot of paranoia in this book, I'm assuming, in future issues, and just like how the artwork was really dark and gritty. I appreciate that. So basically what this is about is there's an explosion at this like max prison, like the highest maximum security prison, like the worst kind of guys are at this prison, and there's an explosion and they assume that it's a bomb and somebody's trying to escape. Well, there's these prisoners that take, in the chaos of the bomb, these prisoners take the guards hostage, and they're trying, obviously, to negotiate with the policeman outside. And there's like this FBI agent, which of course is supposed to be like Dana Scully from the X-Files. At least I got that impression, but I'm a huge X-Files fan, so obviously I'm going to get that impression pretty easily. So she's kind of leading the negotiations. And come to find out, well, I don't know if I want to really spoil anything. Well, let's just say something science fiction-y happens. Like, it wasn't a bomb. It was science fiction-y. I will just put it that way so I don't spoil anything, because I think that it's definitely a book that people should read. It's fantastic. I really enjoyed it. It did everything. It checked every box that I want a #1 to check. It gives us enough action, it gives us enough character development and intrigue, but it definitely doesn't give us all of it. So I'm definitely looking forward to reading the future issues about this book.
Yeah. So obviously we kind of alluded to it when we started the segment that I knew what you were reading this week because I had double checked with you around Multiple Man, and as soon as you were telling me before we started recording that this was a John Carpenter joint, I got pretty interested. So
how long have you been wanting to say that? The John Carpenter joint thing?
It just rolled right off my tongue. I didn't plan that, but
I will believe the joint thing. If you had said tilt, I would be like, no, he planned that.
I've never heard that expression. Is that what the kids are saying?
Well, the Blumhouse, they're tilts.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Gotcha. But anyways, no, it sounds really interesting. I mean, his name attached to it alone piques my interest, so I might have to check that out for sure.
Oh yeah, I would definitely suggest it. It's very, very, very good, and obviously we're big fans of science fiction and John Carpenter, so I think that you would get a kick out of it as well as I did.
Awesome. So you ready for nerd news?
Yeah, go ahead.
So a few things this week, nothing too crazy. This first is a rollover from last week. So last week we went pretty long, so I cut this story out of nerd news, but wanted to bring it up. because we're both huge Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle fans, and it came out, I guess at this point, about a week and a half ago that they were relaunching the films. It's still going to be produced and made by Platinum Dunes, which is the production company that Michael Bay owns, and I'm assuming that Nickelodeon still has the rights, so I'm assuming that they'll still be the studio that puts it out as well. But yeah, we're getting new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So obviously those last two movies were kind of lukewarm, I think, when it comes to reception. So I'm curious to see what route they go with this. I don't think that there's too much you can do to reinvent those characters, except maybe changing their appearance. If you go back and listen to our reviews, like that was my biggest issue I had, was they were huge monsters, and that's not really what I think of when I think of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And, you know, those movies definitely reminded me of Transformers movies and the action sequences. So hopefully we can get away from that. But I'm definitely curious as to what their plans are here.
Yeah, so I was pretty bummed when I saw this, because we definitely hit this pretty hard when we reviewed both of those movies, is that we enjoyed them a little bit more than most critics enjoyed them. And I've said this a million times. I think especially the first one definitely has the heart of the cartoon that I fell in love with. So I definitely appreciate that. Those movies weren't necessarily made for us. They were made kind of for a new generation to love TMNT. So I think if you go into those movies with that in mind, I think that you can definitely have fun with them. And I definitely did. I will, of course, agree with you that the turtles look awful. They shouldn't be 20 feet fucking tall and look like monsters. Like, that's ridiculous. So I would definitely want them to be redesigned. I think that's definitely the first thing that they need to do. But I was kind of bummed, because I love TMNT. Like, that's my thing. Like, I love Star Wars. I love Planet of the Apes, but TMNT is the first thing that really got me into nerd culture. So it's always going to be kind of my first love. And the fact that it just keeps getting rebooted and just keeps getting diluted every single time, it bugs me. And they're never really going to make the movie that I want them to make, because most people don't understand, like, I love the cartoon. Like I said, it's my first love, and I didn't get into the comic book until way, way later. I definitely love the cartoon above everything else, but the comic book is so much different than the movies or the cartoons. So I definitely don't think they're ever going to make that movie, because it's not kid friendly, and that's definitely what they think the Ninja Turtles need to be. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I feel like they kind of struck the perfect balance in the very first TMNT live action movie that they did. Because that movie does have its dark moments, but obviously it's also very fun. So I'm not sure if they could redo that type of movie and still make it, like, I think that's almost the pinnacle of TMNT movies, is that first live action movie. So it just kind of bugs me that I'm never going to get the movie that I really, really want, because they're never going to go full dark on that. They're never going to go Dark Knight for TMNT. But yeah, it just kind of bugs me that it just keeps getting diluted every time they reboot it.
They're going to put that as the tagline for the next movie: rebooted and diluted.
I realized as soon as I said it that it kind of rhymed, and I hated myself a little bit.
No, has that new cartoon started yet?
No, I don't believe it has. I think they have a panel at Comic-Con, and I think it'll probably end up, I don't know if they've announced an official release date for it. I've just kind of, once I saw, not necessarily how they're designed, but just like how they're changing everything, I was just like, I'm kind of done with this.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense. I unapologetically love that first live action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. I stand by that. Like, you go back and you watch it now, and it definitely has its cheesy parts, but that is pure nostalgia gold. And honestly, the best incarnation of those characters in live action, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, maybe it didn't come off that way, but I kind of feel that way too. Is like, I kind of wish that they would go a little bit darker, but I just understand that because of the cartoon, that they're probably never going to do that, and that's probably the closest we're going to get. Kind of they tote that line very well in that first movie. Like, it does have its dark moments, but it's also kind of cheesy as well, and it's kind of have fun moments for the kids, and so I definitely appreciate that movie, and I still think it holds up. The second one definitely goes more campy and ridiculous, but it's not as bad as the third one. The third one's ridiculous and not good at all. But yeah, that first one is really, really good.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So next story, I think that we fancy ourselves in a way, comic book men. So on that note, I just wanted to throw out there, a show that I really enjoyed. I don't know if you kept up with it, but, Comic Book Men, the AMC show from Kevin Smith, has been canceled after 96 episodes. So, like I said, I don't know if you kept up with it. I obviously watched all 7 seasons, I think. But every episode I've watched and I loved. I liked that show. I liked the people on that show. Obviously, you and I are huge Kevin Smith fans, so that played a lot into it. But, definitely disappointed that it was canceled. But at the end of the day, the fact that show got 96 episodes, playing late on Sundays is pretty impressive. So instead of cursing AMC for canceling it, I think I'll just take the high road and just be appreciative that we got so many episodes of that show.
Oh yeah, there's no way that show should have lasted that long. Like, I did not stay with it. I did appreciate, I think I watched the first 3 seasons, and I kind of fell away from it towards the end of the 3rd season, so I may not even have finished the 3rd season, but it was just kind of the same thing over and over again. I did appreciate the guys. I did appreciate the conversations sometimes they had, but the cynical part of me knew that they kind of branded as a reality show, and reality shows aren't reality shows. So that I couldn't turn that part of my brain off at times, and so that kind of bugged me. But I do appreciate the personalities. I've listened to their podcasts and stuff like that, so I definitely like those guys. Ming actually came to Evansville a while back for Secret Headquarters. They had a big event there, so that was pretty cool. Like, they're pretty cool guys, so I do appreciate that, and I do like the fact that they got 7 seasons, even though I wasn't a fan of it towards after like I said, the 3rd season. But yeah, I do appreciate that show, and I'm glad that it got the run that it did, but it was probably time. I think both sides probably knew it was coming.
Yeah, it's funny because Kevin Smith released an episode of Smodcast last week with all of the comic book men on it, and they kind of talked about the show and the cancellation and, where they go from here. And he said every year he expected it to get canceled, but this was the one year where he thought that they would get picked up again because of his heart attack. Like, in his mind, he's relevant again. So he was surprised, but I mean, I think all of them are very appreciative of the opportunity they had to. So, yeah, just disappointing for nerd culture in my mind. Let's see. Last story is concerning one of our favorite actors, Jared Leto. Yeah. I can't tell if you're sarcastically nodding your head or if you're agreeing. But
no, I'm kind of nodding my head because I knew you were going to talk about this, and it makes my heart hurt a little bit. So go ahead.
So yeah, let me just drive that knife in. He is going to be playing Morbius, the living vampire, in the Morbius movie that I think that we've talked about a couple times that Sony's been developing out of the Spider-Man universe. So most likely the same universe that Venom is going to be set in.
So obviously he's a talented actor, but after the Joker, and I don't necessarily think that was all his fault, but don't give him another one of these characters. Like, he's gonna make this character the fucking Hot Topic Morbius, like he did the Hot Topic fucking Joker. Like, don't let him keep doing this. Like, he's a big name, and the only way I think this movie gets made is they got somebody like him to do this character. And I'm definitely intrigued. I'm very, very nervous. It's probably 60-40 nervous / intrigued to see what he's going to come up with this character. But, I mean, it just kind of makes me a little sick to my stomach.
I love Morbius as a character.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And I don't want to sound like a broken record because we've said it every single time we've talked about one of these Spider-Man spinoffs that how do you make this movie without Spider-Man? Like, that's what makes these characters great. And you know, that's where my head is at with that Joker movie they're making. It's like, how do you make a Joker movie without Batman? But all of that aside, like, I do think that Jared Leto is a talented actor. I don't think that anything necessarily that happened with the Joker and Suicide Squad was his fault. I don't think it was his creative choice to cover him with tattoos or give him a grill or anything like that. Like, I think his performance as the Joker was fine. So, you know, the hot topic Joker, I don't think could be blamed on him necessarily. I think that that's like a creative choice that those filmmakers made. But yeah, I mean, I'll see this movie, of course. I just don't have high hopes for it from a story standpoint.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's hard to do Venom without Spider-Man. Like we've said that a million times, but I think of all the Spider-Man villains that you could do, maybe Venom can hold his own movie. But as much as I love Morbius, there's no fucking way. There's no way that movie can be a Morbius movie and not just some cliche vampire movie without Spider-Man. He is not a strong enough character to hold his own movie.
No, not at all. So I'm curious. I'm definitely curious to see the route this production takes, for sure. So that is all I have for nerd news.
All right. So like I talked about earlier, our main topic this week is a second season review of Westworld, which is obviously, like I said, the second season of the HBO series Westworld. It was created for TV by the husband and wife duo, Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy, which I have to say something. It really kind of bugs me. This has nothing to do with the review, but I don't know if you've ever heard Jonathan Nolan talk, but I've heard Christopher Nolan talk. And Christopher Nolan has a very, well, I wouldn't say necessarily strong British accent. Jonathan Nolan has no British accent, and it really bothers me quite a lot. I had to look it up to make sure that they were actually brothers, because I was like, you have no British accent at all. And it kind of bugs me anyways. That's just a small tangent. But, of course, Westworld is based on the Michael Crichton film of the same name. I almost said novel, but it wasn't actually a novel. It was just a film that he wrote and directed. And I guess it got one or maybe even two sequels. I don't remember. But yeah, it was made in 1973. So obviously this is a reboot of that film. And second season, following the events of Dolores' uprising, the park is in chaos, and she starts recruiting more and more hosts to fight against security forces, trying to regain control of the park, while Maeve and her group find that there is more to the park than just Westworld. So this is a show that Tyler has talked about a couple of times, I believe, on past episodes. And of course, it got rave reviews during and of course after season 1 aired. I wanted to watch it for a long time, but for whatever reason, I just wasn't in the mood to watch it. It's definitely a very slow burn, and I just never felt up to it for a long time after season 1 came out. And my wife and I finally decided to give it a try. She lost interest very, very quickly. And I ended up watching a couple episodes after the fact, after she lost interest in it. And then I kind of just, I wouldn't necessarily say lost interest in it. I just kind of fell away from the show for whatever reason. I kind of forgot about it until season 2 premiered. And then I just kind of, once that premiered, I just started back. Like I never watched season 1 at all, even though I think I ended up watching like 5 or 6 episodes. So I just rewatched the season 1 and just picked up with season 2 once I was caught up. And like I said, it's definitely a slow burn, especially the first season. It has a lot of cool moments, but a few here and there in the early episodes, but definitely later in the season it really picks up. And in the earlier episodes, like one of my favorite parts is where like Hector's raid on the brothel with classical music version of Painted Black by the Rolling Stones, which I had to download after I watched that episode because I liked it so much. But like I said, most of the huge moments come later in season 1. And so I was definitely intrigued for season 2, but I was kind of nervous at the same time to see if it was going to follow that same pattern of being really, really slow and then picking up in the last couple of episodes, because I think you can only do that for so long. Just ask Walking Dead and how much we hate that show now. I kind of felt like it goes through that same pattern. So I was definitely intrigued by season 2. Don't let my Walking Dead comparison fool you. It's definitely a very, very far and away better show than that show ever was. But I was definitely intrigued to watch this. I will say before I give it to Tyler, just to get this out of the way, I will be spoiling season 1. So if you haven't already watched season 1, obviously I don't think that we can talk about this show, season 2 anyways, without kind of spoiling some of season 1. So, if you haven't already, just look at the timestamps, skip to Nerd Favorite, and I guess catch us back when you watch this show, because I will definitely be spoiling season 1.
Yeah, so I mean, I've documented my thoughts on Westworld a few times on the podcast. I was a very big fan of season 1, and I stand by that. Season 2, I think I talked about after the first episode or two. And to put things in perspective, I did not watch it again after those first 2 episodes of season 2 until we decided to review it this week, and I had to go back and catch up. So that might be a bit of a spoiler for my review. I know we're going to get into broad strokes in a second. Like, I think that what I liked about season 1 so much was the idea of this park and what people do in these parks. And obviously, like you mentioned in explaining what season 2 is, like, it's more about the host uprising, and I'm not as interested in that. So, I was definitely excited for season 2 when it was coming out. It was a long gap between season 1 and season 2. But at the end of the day, like, we'll get into it in broad strokes, it wasn't necessarily what I was hoping it would be.
For sure, and that kind of leads me into what I want to talk about for my broad strokes, so I'm just going to jump right in. So season 1 really thought we cared what was happening outside of the park, and honestly, I didn't, and I think if I remember correctly, in one of your discussions of season 1, I think you even said that you didn't really care so much what was happening outside of the park versus what was happening inside of the park. And I think season 2 somewhat rectified that, because, I mean, I would say 90% of season 2 is happening within the park, but unfortunately, like you said, most of the park is done. Like, I mean, the park has essentially been shut down, and it's just people trying to survive within this hostile environment, which is interesting at times, but it's not the park that I wanted to see in season 1. So I was a little bit disappointed in that. I like the fact that most of the second season happens within the park, but it's not the same as in season 1. And like I kind of talked about in the intro, is unfortunately, I think that this season, and unfortunately the show as a whole, has followed that same pattern, as it's a very slow burn, and especially season 2, it's a slow burn to the point of being self-indulgent, and it really doesn't get going until really, I would say, the last, like, maybe 3 out of the last 4 episodes are really, I don't want to say that the first few episodes aren't intriguing, because there are some interesting things that happen and some interesting kind of philosophical discussions and what have you in the first few episodes, but it really, the action doesn't really pick up until, I would say, the last, like, 3 out of the last 4 episodes, and that's just not a formula that is going to keep me watching for very much longer.
Yeah, so for me, I kind of hinted at my thoughts when we were kind of doing our intros there, but I would say season 1 was slightly convoluted, but it was easy enough to follow and interesting enough and fresh enough that, it was a show that I really enjoyed. I would say that I really enjoyed season 1 of Westworld. This season was convoluted to the point of just making things too intricate and making things almost boring to a certain extent. This season never really pulled me in, and it asks you to root for characters that I'm not interested in. Some of the episodes were more intriguing than others, but after enjoying season 1 so much, I've got to say, I'm honestly not a huge fan of what season 2 evolved into.
Yeah, and again, that kind of leads me into the first bit of my story discussion, is the fact that I think this show, and I'm sure we've talked about this before on past episodes, but I think this is what you get when you start a show off in such a interesting but also kind of weird note. Like, it is kind of out there that you have a show revolving around these essentially androids that you can go into this park and basically do whatever you want, and it's based in the Old West, and like, it's kind of a weird show. So when you make more and more episodes about this weird show, you have to start peeling back these layers, and it's just gonna get weirder and weirder, and like, you kind of have to go off the rails further and further. And I wouldn't be surprised if this show doesn't last, like, if it lasts more than 4 seasons. I think it would be surprising, because I think that when you start off at such a weird spot in a show, I think that it's not going to take very long for people to be like, this is just too fucking weird for me. Like, I feel like season 1 is where most shows are at like season 3 or 4. Like, the weirdness and just kind of, throwing people for a loop that you have in season 1 is where shows will be like at season 3 or 4. Most of the evolution of different shows in the past. So I think when you already start on that weird footing, it can get to batshit crazy really, really quickly. And obviously I don't think it's quite there yet with season 2. I think there was still some really interesting moments, and it did get me a couple of times, but and I don't want to spoil too much, so I won't get into too much details. It felt like, so after season 1, the big thing that I was always hearing about this show before I had watched it was all of these people, like on Reddit and all these different bloggers and whatnot, would have all these crazy theories about what was happening, because this show is very ambiguous. It doesn't really want to tell you a whole lot what's going on. And so there was always these internet theories, and I feel like they almost went out of their way to prove everybody wrong. Like, it felt like, oh, you think that you know what's happening? Well, we're just going to go the complete opposite of what you think is going to happen just to prove you wrong. And in reality, that doesn't always make for the most interesting stuff. And I think that at points in the show, they probably could have gone a little bit more conventional route, and it may have made for a better show altogether. I will say that I did love the Shogun World stuff, but unfortunately, once you get to the last couple of episodes, it feels like they kind of just went on a field trip, and it didn't really matter towards the end. So I was definitely disappointed in that, because I'm a huge fan of like old kung fu and samurai movies, and I thought that was really cool. And the fact that it didn't really matter towards the end really kind of bummed me out. They did try the whole time jump thing again, and that was actually one of my favorite moments from season 1. It was one of the moments where I was just like, holy shit, that is awesome. Like, I remember when I finally started piecing it together in season 1, I was like, that's genius. I loved how they cut that together, and they kind of led you down this path, and then they completely just pulled the rug out from underneath you. And so I thought that was really cool from season 1. So they kind of tried to do that again, but I thought that it was really smart that they realized that we were going to see that coming a mile away from season 1. So I think that they tried to do it a little bit differently, and it didn't necessarily work as well as it did in season 1, but it did kind of surprise me towards the end. What they did change was a little shocking, but I don't think it even came close to the moment in season 1.
Yeah, I mean, you make a lot of great points there. I think that looking back, maybe they did spread themselves a little too thin in season 1, and they blew their load pretty early in kind of blowing up the concept of Westworld. So I think that that's a really good point on why we're at where we are in season 2. So I definitely think that there is such a thing as being too intricate. I mentioned that in my broad strokes. This was a very convoluted season. And I think that at the end of the day, that might be an understatement. I definitely agree with what you said around the showrunners and writers of this show wanting to swerve the audience as much as possible and go against fan theories. that were created online. And by doing so, they created this warped season with weird timelines and even weirder plot points to do so. You know, if you asked me right now to just sit here and explain Bernard's story arc to you this season from start to finish, I couldn't do it because there are so many loops and twists that I had more questions about what was going on with his character than what were answered. You know, so Bernard's arc is one of many arcs, but I don't think you can be bought into something that you don't understand. That being said, other arcs throughout the season were done really well. I think William's arc was great, and even Dolores's arc and Maeve's arc had its moments. However, even though those arcs had their moments, I found myself having a really hard time latching onto these stories, specifically Maeve's. At the end of the day, I had a really hard time sympathizing with hosts on this show because they aren't real. They're robots. So Maeve's entire quest to find her daughter was uninteresting to me because, one, it's not her real daughter.
It felt stupid.
Yeah, they're both hosts. And three, because the character really annoys me. I agree with you. The Shogun World stuff was really cool. But other than that, I had very little interest. So the question for me around this season comes down to whether or not the story arcs I liked are worth all of the points where I was uninterested. And I don't know that I have the answer to that question, but it should give you an idea of where my head's at around the story of this season.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the Maeve stuff because she's supposed to be like this super enlightened host. Like she's supposed to be above and beyond, maybe not quite on Dolores's plane, but she's supposed to be the most the most woke of all of them.
I knew you were gonna say that. Don't fucking say that.
I had to, but and then she goes off on this little field trip to find her daughter that isn't really her daughter, and she knows that it's not really her daughter. And then she goes to the cabin, and she's surprised when she sees another person there. Like, I knew that shit was happening as soon as we saw the cabin. I was like, her daughter's gonna be there, and there's gonna be another bitch there. And I just don't understand what she expected to happen there. And just from that moment on, I just didn't care. And the fact that they still had that towards the end of the season, like the season finale, she's still trying to save her daughter. And I'm just like, what the fuck, bitch? Just leave. You know where the exit is? Just leave.
No, I 100% agree.
Yeah, it was just, that was very annoying. And I just was very disappointed with the Shogun World stuff that it didn't actually matter because that was really, really cool. And I would have liked to seen more of that and actually have really mattered within the story, but it didn't at all.
It felt kind of weird seeing that in season 1, like Shogun World being hinted at.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, well, we'll get there in season 2. And I liked the stuff that happened at Shogun World, but you're right. It almost felt more like, well, we set this up in season 1 and we have to show it to them, but we don't really have anything to do here that's too crazy. So, you know, it feels like a side quest almost that doesn't really impact the whole story.
Yeah, completely. It felt like, oh, we have 10 episodes to fill, but we really only have 6. So we're going to put this in here and it's not going to matter at all. Just kind of fill out the time. And I honestly was like, when I was taking notes, I didn't want to say that part because I didn't want to make it sound like, oh, well, it's just filler. But I mean, in reality, it kind of is when you think of the actual what matters in the show and what mattered in the story. It is kind of filler, but the stuff that actually happened was really cool. So I didn't want to kind of say that part, but I mean, it is. I mean, when you really sit there and think about it, it really is kind of filler. It's really cool, beautiful looking filler, but that's essentially, as far as the story's concerned, that's really what it is.
I agree.
All right, so moving on to performances. How'd you feel about the performances?
I always feel like when we talk about performances, my mind goes directly to the actors and actresses that I did not like. So I don't want to necessarily do that right off the bat. I mean, I'll get to the performances I don't like, but I'll try to be positive and start with the performances I do like. I think Evan Rachel Wood is a very talented actress, and I don't think that Dolores has a lot of range because again, she's a fucking robot. But I think that what Evan Rachel Wood is asked to do on this show, she does very well. I also think James Marsden has kind of found his niche. Like, he's kind of been an actor that's done not really prominent roles throughout his career. I mean, I guess you could argue Cyclops, but he's always been kind of a filler. And I really appreciate what he did this season, especially, like, no spoilers, but especially when he kind of has a mind shift. Jeffrey Wright is okay. Like, I think that he's a really great actor. Not a huge fan of his character on this show, so I'm not a huge fan of his performances throughout this season, but, he does fine. The one person that I'm going to complain about is Tessa Thompson, which I was surprised by that because I don't dislike her as an actress. Like, I thought she was fine as Valkyrie in Thor Ragnarok. She was even fine in Annihilation when we reviewed that movie. But for whatever reason, whenever she plays Charlotte on this show, she is just not good to me. Like, I don't know if it's overacting or underacting. Like, I'm not an expert on the craft, but there's something off about her performance that really bugs me and really had me rolling my eyes. So, that's the one person I would say kind of made me cringe a little bit when she was on screen.
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily that I cringe. I just didn't buy her character. And so I kind of turned off a little bit. Like, I kind of tuned her out a little bit, which is easy to do in this show just because there's so many threads and it's so ambiguous that if you don't care about something, then it's just kind of like, oh, I'm going to get on my phone and tweet for a little bit and then jump back in when she's not on screen. And that's kind of how I felt about her performance. Was I just wasn't bought into her character at all. I will say that Ben Barnes, who isn't used very much in this show, especially in season 2, I thought some of his stuff, like most notably, there was a particular scene by the pool that I thought was some of the more powerful stuff in the show, especially this season. So I appreciate that. He plays, he's also in Punisher. If you watch that, he's Jigsaw essentially in Punisher season 1. So I was somewhat of a fan of him in that season, and I thought that he did a really good job. Underused definitely in this season, but I thought he did a really good job. I completely agree with you on James Marsden. I actually had the exact same thought to myself when that particular scene happens. And I was like, man, why isn't he in more stuff? Because he's really good in this particular scene. Like, I was blown away about how good he was. And I was just like, why isn't he in more stuff? Like, is he typecast because of the Cyclops stuff? Or, because I think he's in like some romantic comedies here and there, but for the most of the parts that he gets is just junk. And I'm just like, why isn't he in more stuff? Because he's really, really good in this. I will say that I also agree with you with Jeffrey Wright. I think that he does a good job. His character has become, to kind of use your word, convoluted at this point. And so I don't know if I don't care. It's just like, I'm so confused at what's happening with his character that sometimes it's, again, kind of easy to tune him out. I loved Ed Harris in this show. Like, season 1 and season 2, he's by far one of the more interesting and strongest characters. And we're going to talk about notable episodes here in a little bit, but his episode essentially was my favorite of the whole season. So I'm definitely excited to talk about that.
Yeah, I can't believe I didn't bring up Ed Harris. I don't know why he slips my mind, because I really love his character, and I mean, he's a fantastic actor. So he definitely brings a level of gravitas. Is that the word, gravitas?
Sure.
I'm trying to sound smart. I can't even say the fucking word. Either way, he definitely elevates the show by just being on it. So, yeah, he's great as well. So I definitely agree with your performances.
All right. So let's talk about action for a little bit before we jump into notable episodes. So for a show that has a really cool concept and a really cool, like, it sets the stage especially at the end of season 1, to be like, okay, it's going to be this action-packed season. Season 2, I was pretty disappointed with the action. And it's not necessarily that it's not done well, because it is. It's just the fact that there's not that much of it. When the shit hits the fan at the end of season 1, you think, okay, they're going to start off with a bang and we're going to have all this crazy action. And like I said, it just kind of is very self-indulgent, and they don't give us as much as they do in season 1. So I was pretty disappointed in that.
I agree 100%. There should have been much more action throughout this season. When there was action, it was good. Like, the stuff on Shogun World really stands out as being a lot of fun. I definitely like the third take on the paint it black scene.
Oh yeah, for sure. That was awesome.
Mentioned earlier, like that was really cool. But this season felt like there was a lot more of shooting people in the back, or, quick fire, with guns. Like there wasn't any big set piece that really stands out to me as being really cool. So it was definitely more character driven, and it's not that I fault them for that. I think that if you're able to do a show like this and make it character driven, like more power to you. But the problem is, they could have filled a lot of dead space with bigger Wild West action sequences that could have been cool, and they chose not to, which was disappointing.
Yeah, for sure. So let's jump right into notable episodes. I have 2, and I kind of do this a lot when we do our season reviews of TV shows, is I'll kind of pick one that I really liked and one that I didn't like. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have the same episodes. I'm almost positive we're going to have the same episodes. If you did what I did, I think the episode that is the best episode is pretty obvious. And then the one that was the worst, I think, is also pretty obvious. So which episode do you want to start with first?
I'm curious to see if we're on the same page here. Was your worst episode 8?
Did you say episode 8 because you didn't want to try to pronounce the title of the episode?
Kiksuya?
Yes, it is. It's clearly the least interesting episode. Which, surprisingly, I looked this up because I was just curious. I looked this up. It is, I think, if not the highest Rotten Tomato score of all the episodes, or is it like the second highest? People love that episode, and I was just like, I'm bored as fuck right now.
So I'm torn here. I didn't necessarily pick this episode because I thought it was inherently bad. I picked this episode because it obviously stands out amongst the 10. I do like that they gave a background to this character that they focus on, but I don't know that we need an hour of it. And at the end of the day, like, the idea here was to give this character more emotional weight, but it's kind of like the same thing I said with Maeve. He's a robot. He's a host.
Yeah.
I just, that's where I really struggle with this show, is they're really pushing me to care about these hosts. And in the back of my mind, it's like, you're not a real person.
Yeah.
And that's where I struggle.
Yeah. And I say that I was bored. It's not because it's not a well put together episode, and it's well acted. It's well put together, like I said, and the writing's really great. And so I kind of understand why critics would enjoy this episode, but it doesn't really matter. Kind of like the Shogun stuff. I think this episode matters more than the Shogun stuff matters, because his character does play a part later on in the season. And so I do appreciate the arc that they gave it, but I kind of felt like it was forced, because he's not a character that we necessarily see too much in season 1 or care about in season 1. And it's not like he's really sprinkled in throughout season 2. It's almost like, oh, we're getting towards the end of the season. We need this character to matter, so we're going to give him a whole episode. And I appreciated some of the stuff that they tried to do, but at the same time, it just kind of felt like we were watching what you said earlier, like a side quest, oh, we need some background information, so we're going to give you this whole episode, instead of trying to like sprinkle it in throughout. Like, there's so many times where they kind of did that with other characters. Is like they'll just cut to that character's story for a little bit, and then we'll get 2 or 3 minutes of it, or maybe 5 or 10 minutes of it, and then it'll give us something else. And that's how they did most of the character development in this show. But for whatever reason, they just decided to give him an entire story like an entire episode, and just, I don't know, towards the end of it, I was just kind of checked out.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense, man. So the other episode, I'm guessing you already alluded to it, episode 9.
Yeah, Vanishing Point is by far the best episode of the season. It is the Man in Black stuff, the Ed Harris stuff. We get a lot of his backstory in season 1, obviously, because he's the main, essentially, villain in season 1, and you sympathize with him a little bit more in season 2, and you kind of, it's weird because at one point of this episode, and it kind of just tells you how good this episode is, it's like you almost start to sympathize for him a little bit, and you're like, hey, maybe he's not this bad of a guy, and then you're like, oh yeah, he is that bad of a guy. Like, he is a sociopath and only cares about his time in the park and really doesn't care about his family at all. And he's just essentially pretending to be this really great guy and great husband and great father. And essentially he's this horrible person that doesn't really care about any of those things. And I just think that it was brought home by really good performances, especially by Ed Harris, because they tease what happens to his wife several times, and that's like the easiest thing that they could have done with the show, but because it's so well done, it didn't matter that, okay, that's what I initially assumed happened to her. So that's kind of going back to what I said earlier, was they don't always have to do this batshit crazy stuff. Sometimes they can just do the obvious things, but because they are talented filmmakers and they have really good actors, it will still work. Like, this is probably the most like cliche, obvious plot point that they could have put in the show, but yet it was the strongest part of the show because it was so well done. So it doesn't always have to be batshit crazy, and people will still enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I'm really glad that this episode kind of takes a step back, but it doesn't take a step back to show us the story of a random Native American character. It takes us back to show the story of a character that's been around 20 episodes, or I guess 19 episodes at this point, and adds even more weight to a character that we've really come to, I don't want to say empathize with, but a character that we've been on this journey with for so long. So I thought that the episode was really amazing, gave a lot of context to a lot of great plot points, and for sure the best episode of the season by far.
All right, so I think that's about it for our season 2 review of Westworld. What'd you give it as far as star rating out of 5 stars?
It's pretty tough because I'll watch season 3 of this show. Like, I'm not giving up on it yet. So in my mind, the fact that I'm going to stay with it, I feel like I would need to give it a 3. But if I'm being realistic with how this season was done, I'm going to give it a 2.5.
Yeah, I kind of went the other way. I was debating between 3.5, but as it normally goes when we do these reviews, it seems like we're a little bit more negative, and the more I thought about it, the more I was kind of leaning towards a 3. So I think I'm going to go with 3, and hopefully, like you said, you'll be watching this season 3 of this show, and so will I. So here's hoping that it gets a little bit better.
For sure. So that's going to bring us to Nerd Favorite. It's my week for Nerd Favorite, and it's tied very much into Westworld. So pretty good segue there. So I just want to know fairly simply who your favorite Westworld character is. It sounds like we might have the same answer here, but I'll go ahead with mine first. Mine is by far William. I think that it's just a very intricate character. Obviously, we said we'd spoil season 1, so watching him go from his young self to, his first time in Westworld to, what he ends up being and how he ends up kind of, taking a share in the park and what he's trying to do outside of the park and his family. And there's just so many layers to his character and what makes him the Man in Black. And that, I really appreciate that. Like, his story has always been the most interesting to me, and I'm looking forward to seeing what his story is like in season 3.
Yeah, so that's the most obvious answer, and obviously if it was my week, that would have been my answer as well. So just for the sake of conversation, kind of my second favorite. And honestly, he wasn't my favorite character at the beginning of season 1 because he was a very generic character, but his arc throughout the season 1, and really it kind of takes a couple of different turns in season 2, is Teddy, which we've already talked. A lot of that has to do with James Marsden's performance of Teddy. I just think that he overall is a very interesting character just from start to finish. How his character changes throughout season 1, and then of course he changes a couple of times in season 2, and again that has a lot to do with the performance. So yeah, I like Teddy as well, but far and away it's William for sure.
Awesome.
All right, so that is it for, I believe this is episode 196 of the Nerd You're Looking For podcast. As always, we appreciate it if you subscribe, rate, review us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, basically any good podcatcher you use, we're on it. You can also check out our website, thenerdspodcast.com. I recently updated my video game journal. I had beaten Detroit, Become Human, and I wrote a review of that. And as soon as I get that stupid achievement for Limbo, I will definitely be writing a Limbo review as well. So you can check that out on our website, thenerdspodcast.com, and comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Nerd You're Looking For, or soon to be called the Pat Attack channel. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. They're both at The Nerds Podcast. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Google+. Email us at thenerdsyou'relooking4@gmail.com. And finally, vote for us for Podcast of the Month at podcastland.com. For Patrick Kuhn,
Tyler Hunt.
we are the Nerd You're Looking For. Take it easy, guys.
Later, guys.